Amnoon, thank you very much. I'll go straight to the point because I really want us to have a chance for discussion as well, despite the late start. It's a privilege to be here. I thought that by this stage in the conference, we would all be quite aware of the scale and the range of the violations against the Baha'is and, in fact, against others as well, and that it would be important to step back and also look to the future. And I'll be very much continuing the same thrust that Professor Afshari was sharing. So what has been the impact of the violations against the Baha'is and others for the development of human rights in Iran, for the respect of human rights as a whole in Iran? And given the pattern of human rights violations more generally and also against the Baha'is in Iran, to what extent can we see glimmerings for the development of human rights receptivity and consciousness in Iran? And in order to do this, I thought it might be useful to draw from some theoretical frameworks that explore the impact of universal norms and international advocacy for the promotion of human rights in domestic contexts. And what are the conditions, to explore what are the conditions under which domestic human rights change is most likely to occur. And from scanning these in a very brief way in the few minutes that we have today, we can see that there is some room for optimism, there is also room for concern, but ultimately I would like to suggest that in terms of receptivity and consciousness, we're on an upward trend or a positive note. Now, when we talk about universal human rights, it's obviously borderless. Human rights are indivisible, they're interdependent, and there's no difference between promoting the rights of a Baha'i, a Jew, a woman, whatever minority or majority, whatever gender, it's identical. I do respect that the focus of this conference has been a unique one. I think it's been a historic one. It serves a purpose, but I would sympathize with some of the comments made earlier that as we continue this dialogue, obviously we should broaden its horizons and situate more broadly, because human rights are for all. And in order to, for example, respect the rights of Baha'is in Iran, as Professor Afshari said so beautifully, there will need to be systemic corrections in Iran that will benefit everybody. It might be that the case of the violations against the Baha'is in Iran has certain unique elements. It might be that the sheer scale, the consistency, the pattern, the institutionalization, there are some elements that make it stand out, but none of them are unique, and all of them share unfortunate partners in Iran, partners in victimhood. So more broadly, yes, the claim of the Baha'i international community to international human rights norms stretches back to 1980, and before, in fact, but if we look at the recent episode. And the advocacy also has been somewhat pioneering. I mean, if you hear the story about how did the first Iran resolution come about in the UN, it was a couple of people shaking hands with different members of the subcommission, and it's almost funny, but that was groundbreaking, and it was the early days of raising the Iran case at the United Nations. So there is, that kind of uniqueness or pioneering role, but none of this detracts from the fact that promoting Baha'i rights in Iran would promote the rights of everybody and should be irrespective of, it's certainly, the aim is not to single out. That goes against the whole thrust of universal human rights. Now, we talked about norms and advocacy, and in terms of the advocacy for the rights of the Baha'is in Iran, that has been simultaneously domestic and universal, I would like to suggest. So, prisoners standing up in a principled way for their rights in a prison are themselves human rights advocates. But on the other hand, they are assisted internationally by media coverage, by advocacy in the UN, in the EU, in all corridors of power, in bilateral and multilateral avenues. So earlier, yesterday, there was a discussion about advocating for the rights of others. I think in principle that is absolutely correct. But I want us to stand back and look at that question more broadly. Do we expect Aung San Suu Kyi to stand up for the rights of the Tibetans? Do we expect the Dalai Lama to stand up for the rights of indigenous peoples and Nelson Mandela for the rights of Muslims in Europe? Yes, in principle they should, and when they advocate for rights irrespective of all identity characteristics, then in fact they are already, their advocacy is by nature universal. They might be claiming one particular group because that's the most, first of all, they have the authorization to speak on behalf and advocate on behalf of that group. And secondly, that might be in their immediate experience. But in principle, I totally agree with you. But sometimes, for example, if the Baha'i international community advocated for the rights of, I don't know, the Shi'i in Bahrain, would they really want it? Would that benefit them? I mean, of course, networks of advocacy should always be explored, and we should see whether we ask the Dalai Lama to stand up for the rights of Iranians. It might be powerful when it's appropriate, but there should be mutual consent behind it. So I don't know that that's a charge that we can use against any representative of a particular group. Now, let's go back to the question of the case of the Baha'is and the appeal to international human rights norms in Iran. Now, the norms that have been claimed over the past 32 years and beyond have been the claim for non-discrimination, for equal citizenship, for equality before the law, for no arbitrary detentions or killings, for freedom of expression, the right to work, the right to education, for minority rights, for freedom of religion or belief, and so on. And we can see that since 2009 in particular, many more Iranians are advocating on the international scene for these same rights, and also domestically they have been active in claiming for these very rights. So the lobby for domestic human rights change in Iran has been augmented dramatically over the last 2 years. The serious deficiencies that lead to violations of freedom of expression are the same regardless of the victims. Has this led to an increase in human rights receptivity and consciousness in Iran? If we look at the theories, we find that the main channel for bringing about human rights change is considered to be domestic political processes. And we know full well that these domestic political processes have been highly constrained, especially in recent years in Iran. Now, these theorists also draw attention to the need for a transparent state machinery and for independent non-governmental actors to be, so independent such that they are they have the possibility of opposing. So these theoretical requirements are not very promising for the Iranian human rights scene. However, independent voices remain in Iran. Independent non-governmental organizations have very much been closed down, suppressed. Even media channels, independent voices, are being closed week by week, month by month. But however, those human rights voices remain, whether they are within the country or have had to escape. So in Iran, we have a context in which there has been international NGO concern for human rights since the early 80s. There was a period of the flourishing of domestic NGO activism and networks within Iran, but there has been a severe clampdown in the past 6 years. But voices for human rights remain and in fact have magnified outside the country. Goodman and Jinks have written a book about how we should bring about human rights in domestic contexts where there is state resistance in particular. And, how do we bring about human rights change? We rely on coercion, we rely on persuasion, and we rely on acculturation. Coercion, we all understand, and an example of that could be the use of sanctions against Iran. Persuasion is trying to inculcate human rights norms on a particular state, and we can think about the EU human rights dialogue on one such example. But acculturation is where a state adopts the behavioral patterns of the surrounding culture, of human rights culture. And we see that the mimicry of human rights language stretches back to the early 80s in Iran. And even if this mimicry is hypocritical, it nevertheless leaves lasting traces. How do I cut back? Theorists also suggest that the political opportunity for bringing about human rights change is magnified where there is relative openness in the political system, so not terribly promising in the case of Iran, where there are elite alignments within the country, there are elites within the country that support human rights change, and I think there have been some openings in Iran, and the fatwas of Montazeri, for example, on the case of the Bahais were mentioned earlier in this conference. And thirdly, they point to elite allies internationally that may support human rights change domestically. And I would suggest that this is a very promising avenue for Iran. The elite allies, the global voices for human rights change in Iran have increased a lot, especially in the past 2 years. Finally, they draw attention to where the propensity for repression in a country is reduced, the chances of human rights change are increased. Unfortunately, we see the reverse at this current moment in Iran. Norm salience is another point that human rights theorists draw attention to. What is the salience? What is the meaning? What is the receptivity of human rights norms in Iran? Now, I think this again shows, as Professor Afshari said earlier, shows a lot of promise in Iran. Norm salience is normally used to refer to state actors accepting the salience of universal human rights norms on their activities. We don't see that in Iran, but in terms of public consciousness and public support, I think the salience of norms, even the language of human rights was being used by international NGOs for Iran, but it wasn't being used within Iran. And even victim populations in Iran or victimized individuals wouldn't turn to human rights to champion their own causes. And it's perhaps desperation and just the increase in repression that means that now there is much more salience and much more usage of human rights norms within Iran and for Iranians in terms of international advocacy. So if I go to the conclusion, I hope that the track record, the Baha'i track record of referencing universal norms for the promotion of human rights and also the advocacy pattern and just the knowledge of bringing about and promoting advocacy at the UN level will serve to also broaden that for all Iranians. Because advocating universal norms and universal standards in Iran will, as suggested earlier, are borderless and will benefit all Iranians. There are concerns in Iran in terms of repression not having gone down, in terms of domestic allies for human rights largely having been silenced, but in terms of international allies and norm salience in Iranian public consciousness, I think we're at a very positive moment for the development and the flourishing of human rights consciousness and culture in Iran. Unfortunately, this has come with a very high price, and there have been many sacrifices along the way. The rights stakeholders in Iran have broadened. There are from film producers to journalists to anybody who is considered to be principled or politically active. More and more people are being victimized in Iran. In this sense, therefore, the Iranian government has been instrumental in promoting human rights norm salience in Iran and in making all of us, Kurds, Baha'is, wagers of war against God, threats to national security. In this sense, we are all Nasreen, Baha'is, Fariba, and we should salute these brave people for their principled sacrifices in creating the landscape for the flourishing of human rights in Iran and a better future. Thank you.